Well, Tim, the police are demanding lots more money to fight crime. You would imagine there must be a spending review ahead for the Chancellor.
Poor Rachel Reeves. She's got the Economist to the right of her, Reform to the left, and she's stuck in the middle with no one. And the fundamental problem here is, what is a Labour government in power to do? It's not just in power to cut budgets, it's in power by its own lights to spend more and redistribute money. So you're going to see a real tension here between what Rachel Reeves is being told by the Treasury you must do and what members of her own cabinet want her to do.
So, Tim, a letter today published by a significant number of chief police officers, including Sir Mark Rowley, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, the most important police officer in the land, saying to the Chancellor they need more money. Otherwise, their targets to recruit 13,000 additional police officers, to halve knife crime, and to halve the rates of violence against women and girls, all pledged by the Labour government before the election, they will not be met.
Here is Mark Rowley on the Today programme this morning.
So the Home Office announced a 1.1 billion increase in police funding to 19.6 billion in England and Wales. And just looking at the GLA website, in May 2015, the Met had 31,741 officers. This February, it's up to 33,201. That's an increase of nearly 1,500. So some public figures would suggest that you've got more officers and more money. That doesn't look like austerity, does it?
Our numbers are falling rapidly. London's over 1 million people bigger since then. Demand is going up 5% a year. Every year across the country, 5% more people are calling 999 looking for help from police. That's a massive number, and that compounds year on year. If I was to have, and just to use London as an example, because I know the numbers better, but other chiefs could make the same case across the country. If I was to have in London today the resources to match the population that we had sort of 12, 15 years ago, we did best part of £1 billion more. New York is massive, is the same size city. They've got massively more numbers of police officers and police staff to deal with it. We're under capacity on international measures. We're under capacity if you look across Europe in terms of police officers per capita compared to the UK. So it's not just a wild pipe dream. This, if you look at benchmarks, it's a big issue with our history, with internationally. And then we've got all these new threats. We've got global instability. We've got communities that are more volatile. Look at the awful events that sparked across the country out of the attack in Southport last year. And we've got a government that's really ambitious about what it wants policing to do. And we're up for that.
Now, Tim, listening to Sir Mark there, obviously no one is going to argue that the police should not be properly resourced. But I think Amar Rajan, as you say, was the presenter there asking the questions. If you look at the figures, it is quite hard to make the case that since 2016, the police have not had a lot of extra funding and there are not more police officers on the beat. So the number of police officers has gone up. The amount of funding has also gone up. Now, recording of crime has gone up, but the actual incidence of crime, so the experience that people have of crime, is actually coming down. There's one big area there that actually is the caveat, which is computer and internet fraud, digital fraud. That is an area where it is real growth, but other categories of crime have come down. And trust is at historic lows in the police, and also conviction rates, for example, for the most serious offences, for example, against women, sexual assaults and rape, have absolutely collapsed. So, as we said at the beginning, is this about more money or is it actually about reform?
And these things are connected. So as online fraud has gone up, more police have been directed away from perhaps being on the street, which is where we traditionally like to think of them being, and towards sitting in front of a computer. So if they're doing that, we don't see them so much. And I think their reputation was damaged a great deal by COVID. It's been damaged by the availability of videos of the police in operation on social media. Once you can see them in action, some of the mystique is lost. And I think some people feel, okay, everyone could always do with some more money in their department, but the issue actually is you're not meeting my priorities when it comes to policing. It's a misallocation of resources rather than necessarily you've been starved of funds by wicked Dickensian governments.
And we always get this game, don't we, Tim, ahead of a significant spending or fiscal announcement by the government. departments that feel themselves, and in this case, the Home Office and then the police, who feel themselves to be under pressure, start briefing the media that they're under pressure. The ones that you don't hear from are usually the ones that are going to do quite well. So we haven't heard much yet from leading military chiefs. Usually we get the military chiefs coming out saying we must spend more on defence, but obviously Keir Starmer has already said we're going to spend more on defence. We haven't heard that much from the NHS, although the resident doctors, what we used to know as junior doctors, are demanding this eye-watering wages increase for their members, 29%, which the government simply will not be able to agree to. And actually there's quite a lot of evidence that the public don't believe that the doctors should be paid that much more than they are paid at present. So we will see this run of warning briefings from those departments which fear being cut. We've had the police today. You could imagine in schooling, for example, that could come quite soon with the teachers agitating towards possible industrial action. The justice system and prisons, we've already heard a lot about early release of prisoners will make the job actually harder for the police, because obviously criminals will be back on the streets when they would have been in prison previously.
And we've heard a lot recently from Rayner about her ambitions. Right? This newspaper has reported that she was arguing behind the scenes for taxing more rather than cutting welfare. And what does she want to do? She wants to spend a lot more on social housing, which costs money. Ed Miliband wants to spend more on net zero, which costs money. And the fundamental problem here is, what is a Labour government in power to do? It's not just in power to cut budgets. It's in power, by its own lights, to spend more and redistribute money. So you're going to see a real tension here between what Rachel Reeves is being told by the Treasury you must do, and what members of her own cabinet want her to do, either out of ambition or because they think it's the Labour Party's historic crusade.
I think actually that there is something beyond that, which is that Rachel Reeves is not actually one of those more traditional left Labour chancellors that simply wants to spend more. I think she genuinely, and I spoke to her a lot before the election, she would be a proud chancellor, as was Gordon Brown, the last chancellor of the United Kingdom to actually pay back some of the UK's gargantuan debts.
Right.
Rachel Reeves would love to stand up in the last year or two of this Labour government and say this Labour government, because we have brought growth back, has been able to cut, not bring down the deficit, but eliminate the deficit and actually pay back some of our debts. I think Rachel Reeves is actually cut from a different cloth than Keir Starmer. And the tension that is now growing is that Keir Starmer fears his left wing, Angela Rayner, and those she represents on his backbenchers, than he fears his chancellor, because he is in danger of leaving her swinging in the wind. She was the person who staked her reputation on the winter fuel allowance cut, on not increasing the two-child family benefit cut, not increasing it despite there being huge pressures. And now Keir Starmer is briefing that both those things are going to be overturned. And Rachel Reeves said, that will not happen. I made the tough decisions to fill this supposed £22 billion black hole. I would start focusing quite intensely on the relationship between number 10 and number 11. As always in governments, that is the key relationship, and that is the relationship upon which so many governments flounder.
It's not a good look when a government goes overnight from appearing to be mean to being weak. And that's what the U-turn looks like, because it looks like the Prime Minister caving to the backbenchers, and we're all bracing for him to cave to the public sector unions over pay as well. But of course, he's not just under pressure from his backbenchers now, he's also under pressure to spend more from Nigel Farage, which is a twist we didn't see coming in this plot, and is an example of how it's become so very difficult for people in government to make tough fiscal decisions and stick by them, because the opposition almost will just disregard philosophy and disregard possibly even the interests of the country in order to pick up the voters who Labour is abandoning.
So we're just 2 weeks away, Tim, from this spending review. This will be one of the most significant events of this government. Rachel Reeves will lay out on June the 11th the spending plans for all of the major departments of government for the next 3 years. Get it wrong, and the reforms and the funding that needs to be put in place to improve the public services, which is one of the top voter demands from this government. It will be a disaster if they get the calculations wrong. And there are so many pressures on the Chancellor. And to take us through some of those pressures, Tim, Tom Clougherty, he's the director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, joins us now on the Daily Tea. Tom, welcome back to the Daily Tea. I think the last time we were together was sitting on College Green at Westminster on Budget Day. The waspy women who were the campaigners for pension rights for women were blowing their vuvuzelas with gusto. But we were talking there, Tom, weren't we, about fiscal discipline, and was fiscal discipline in at least politicians' minds now for the birds? We have a situation here where, as is usual before major public spending announcements, which we're going to get on June the 11th, various parts of the public sector start coming out saying our job is impossible without a lot of more money. What's your sense, Tom, about where Rachel Reeves is at the moment and the pressures she is under?
I can't imagine she's enjoying life very much at the moment, to be quite frank. I mean, it's a very difficult situation to be in because she has pressures on both sides. The economy, although we seem to have had a good first quarter, I suspect that might be revised away because of seasonal adjustments and so on. That might look slightly rosy, though. But on the other hand, the tax take is already very high. She's got very little headroom against her fiscal rules. The relatively small spending cuts that the government has tried to push through already seem to be unraveling. And so it's just a sort of a toxic mix, actually, where the people don't want to pay more tax. I sympathize with that. Public services are demanding more money, as you say. They probably get a lot of support on that front from Rachel Reeves's backbenchers. That doesn't make life easy either. And the economy generally is still stagnating. And of course, the government talks a lot about its growth strategy. And that would be the sort of silver bullet that got her and us out of this mess. But there's not a lot of substance there so far. Maybe a few encouraging things around housing, but then if you look at what they've done on tax, what's coming on labour regulation, if you look at all the net zero stuff, those are big countervailing pressures that really, I think, just embed the kind of stagnation we've been experiencing. So it will feel, I think, over at the Treasury, a bit like no way out. There are no really good options if you are Rachel Reeves at this moment in time.
Now, we wrote a leader just before Nigel Farage made his announcements about the cuts that he wants to reverse that Labour have made, for example, to the winter fuel allowance and also the two-child benefit cap, which Labour said they want to stick to. And in our leader, we said politicians have lost the art of being honest with the public, that you can't just endlessly borrow without overburdening the following generations with huge costs of that borrowing, which now is costing the UK more than, for example, we spend on education. I mean, what has happened in politics where, if we think back to the formation of the IEA, the first sort of real Thatcherite, or one of the first Thatcherite think tanks around fiscal discipline, what has happened in the political debate that means that from Nigel Farage to Rachel Reeves, and frankly probably even to Kemi Badenoch, it's now constant, yes, we must increase all funding for public services?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the result of, on the one hand, chronic short-termism, because it's always easy to defer the bills to the next parliament or the next generation. You're not the politician that's going to have to worry about that. I think probably the dynamics of our modern-day politics make that problem worse because politicians are constantly put on the spot. How are you going to solve this problem? What are you going to do about that? The easy thing is to say, well, we'll spend a bit of money or perhaps we'll regulate or whatever it is. So you get this constant kind of ratchet effect. Now, I think the other thing that has happened, though, is that we went through a long period after the financial crisis where debt did seem, fairly costless. And a lot of people were saying, well, you should be borrowing more, you should be spending more. And of course, you had a conservative Liberal Democrat government that was trying to exercise spending restraint for much of that period. I think even before COVID, the spending taps had been opened again a little bit, but the pandemic really threw them wide open. And, everyone got the idea, well, you can just spend, you can spend. The government can magic up this money out of thin air. And what does it matter? Now, of course, that all came crashing down famously around Liz Truss and the mini budget. And I think we're living in the wake of that experience now, where on the one hand, it is very clear, and I think policymakers when they're in those decision-making positions like Rachel Reeves is, will be very conscious of things like the bond markets and borrowing costs, and they will know that they don't have a lot of freedom of maneuver. But I think psychologically, so many other people, they still have that short-termism where they just want to solve problems in an easy way by throwing money at them. But secondly, they're still in this mindset that, well, we've been running huge deficits now for, 15 years? Probably longer than that, because kind of Gordon Brown started ramping these things up in the early 2000s. And after all, it's all gone okay, hasn't it? I think that's the sort of psychology that we're stuck in and that we really need to break free of. But I mean, I'm glad you're saying what you're saying in Leaders at the Telegraph. More people need to be saying it, because I think there is, some of the onus here has to be on the general population and on the voter to hold politicians to account, and to say, if a politician sort of promises everything, as it seems like Reform are tending to do, higher benefits and lower taxes simultaneously, and they're not the only ones, by the way, all politicians do this, we need to say, okay, that might sound nice, but we know it's not realistic, and we're not going to vote for it as a result.
Tom, if we had a Corbynite here on the podcast, they might leap on that phrase short-termism and say austerity was the short-term mistake. Because if you cut funding for services, you just have to spend more later on to make up for the social cataclysm that occurs. So an example might be, as we were discussing policing earlier, if you cut police numbers, then later on you just got to raise police numbers because you need a certain number of policemen to police the streets. And perhaps the most dramatic example was local government funding. It was capped. It was impossible for local governments to raise it. They were expected to spend more on adult and social care. And what a surprise, 10, 15 years later, the social services are overburdened, and now we have to raise council tax bills to make up for that. So is there a counter-argument for saying, actually, the real problem was Tory austerity because it built up so many social crises that then had to be bailed out in the future?
Yeah, I agree with some of that. Naturally, I don't agree with all of it, but I do think there's an element of truth there. So look, I don't think that austerity as a general thing, or let's call it fiscal consolidation, was a mistake. I think we had overspent, we had overborrowed, and we needed to bring the state back down to size. What I think was a mistake is the very short-termist way that austerity was pursued, right? So I can remember saying at the outset, kind of in 2010, there have to be two phases to this process. So if you have a real fiscal crunch and you have to save money kind of this year, next year, well, then obviously you just kind of you cut a little bit off every budget across Whitehall, you hold down wages, you hold down benefits. And you can do that for a little while, but that can't just be the be all and end all. You have to move beyond that. There has to be a second phase where you're not just talking about let's hold down budgets and keep trying to do the same things. It's about how do we reform? How do we focus on doing some things better and not doing other things at all? And I think what you got through the austerity years was actually the state becoming more and more imbalanced, to the extent that it wasn't already a healthcare system and a pension system and a welfare system with an economy attached. It became more and more that. So we protected health budgets. Actually, the Conservative governments were very generous towards elderly voters, pensioners, and so on as well. And again, this was short-termist because they didn't do anything to offset those rising costs elsewhere in a meaningful way. They just pushed the budgets down. And I think that is a problem. And actually, it goes back to the intro you did about policing. Now, leaving aside their specific demands at the moment for this spending review, it is clearly the case that those bits of the state and of government that I might think of as core functions of the state, that whatever you're doing, you want the government to do these things and do them well, like policing and like the courts and like a handful of other things, those have been neglected. And so I think we've been in this, cakeist environment, if you like, where we think we can have our cake and eat it too, when it comes to tax and public spending. You can't carry on doing all the same things and just trying to make them cheaper and cheaper, especially when you have a public sector which is getting less and less efficient over time. At a certain point, this is going to break down. And, frankly, you don't want to be the politician who's there when it breaks down. But I feel like maybe Rachel Reeves is.
On the actual demands themselves, which Rachel Reeves is going to be dealing with on June the 11th, it's already clear they're going to protect defence, and defence spending is actually going to go up. And given the events in Ukraine and elsewhere, the public do support that. NHS is another protected, or health is another protected department, although actually Public faith in the NHS itself is at record low levels, so they're not actually producing services that the public are pleased with. Is that method of ring fencing certain departments and then having to do this salami slicing across all the other departments, including the Home Office, the Justice Department, which, as you say, do run very, very significant parts of what the public would imagine to be key functions of the state, keeping us safe, for example? How should Rachel Reeves approach this June the 11th review? It's the first time we've had a review for a number of years. They say they're going to do this real root and branch approach. Is there a different approach, or are we just going to constantly approach this cliff edge and in the end fall over it?
I think, unfortunately, we are just going to keep circling around that cliff edge and hoping we don't fall over. Because when the Treasury talks about doing a root and branch review, I mean, I'd love to actually see the methodology they're using, because as far as I can tell, no root and branch review of public spending has happened in a long, long time, if ever. It's the same for the tax system, by the way. Both sides of our fiscal policy are made in this very kind of fly by the seat of our pants way, where we will have periodic fiscal events, be they spending reviews, be they budgets or autumn statements or whatever. And people are just trying to turn the knobs on the dashboard, right? They're trying to fine tune. They're not really thinking things through from fundamentals. So on tax reform, I think you should, at least in your imagination, you should tear up the whole tax system, work out how much money you need to raise and what is the least costly, least economically damaging way to do it, and do some kind of big bang tax reform. But I think something similar has to happen on the spending side as well. And the way I tend to think of it is, we should look at all of the different things that government does. And of course, there's demands for endless amounts of services and activities and everything else. And if you look at each of them individually, they will all seem valuable, or at least they'll have a powerful or noisy constituency that's very keen that they continue. It makes prioritization extremely difficult. What you have to do, I think, is essentially write down a list of everything you're doing and then rank it in order of how important is it and how effective is it. Is this something that we really need to be spending hard-earned taxpayers' money on? And when you've got your list of priorities, effectively, you know how much money you've got to spend. You go down that list, funding them properly, until you run out. Now, I'm not saying this is the actual exercise they should do, but at least that's the style of the exercise that should be going on. It should be working out, what are our priorities? How much money is it going to take to fund them? And when we run out of money, we say, well, look, sorry, all these other things, I know you can make a case for them, but actually we're not putting those at the top of the list. Those are things that are going to have to fall by the wayside, and we'll find other ways to do them, whether it's the private sector stepping in or charities or whatever. Sometimes I think you just have to be bold, because the alternative is just we're stuck in this endless mission creep of government where it accumulates more responsibilities, where people don't really want to fund those responsibilities effectively, which I could entirely sympathize with. And you get government which gets bigger and also worse, and everyone gets more and more fed up. And you end up in the situation, it just seems a bit like a kind of governing death spiral. And so I think it really needs bold, radical reform to break out of that. Now, the problem is, when you're in government, every incentive is about tomorrow's headlines or next week's headlines, if you're really thinking far ahead, or maybe the autumn headlines when you do your next fiscal statement. But that long-term radical reform, I don't think they ever get time to do it unless, as politicians, they've worked it out in advance. And I think one of the big failings, sadly, of the current government is that they came in without well-formed ideas of what they could do or what they wanted to do. And it does seem to me they thought, we've got some ambitions, we don't know how we're going to achieve them, but we'll ask the civil service and they will tell us. And they found out pretty quickly that it doesn't work like that.
Tim, what we need is a mixture of the big society, Doge, and 10-year parliaments.
But do we also need to take reform out of the equation here? Because what you're suggesting, one might argue, Labour started to do by trimming some benefits, such as winter fuel payments, and by not restoring the cap on 2 children receiving family benefits. But the Tories might have got along with that. But reform is now outbidding Labour by saying we'll restore that, which pushes more pressure on Labour to go back to protecting the welfare state and actually increasing money on it. So does Nigel Farage actually make it harder to do what you're saying we should do, which is to have an honest conversation about what we can and can't afford and permit politicians to get on with doing that?
It certainly seems that way at the moment, doesn't it? And I wouldn't say I was surprised, because political logic points in this direction for reform to become a sort of welfarist party as well as a kind of nationalist party as well. It's always been unclear to me where exactly will they end up politically, because a lot of the personalities involved are effectively old-fashioned Thatcherites. I think Nigel Farage is one of those himself. But if you look at the seats they're going to be trying to win to make a big breakthrough, maybe being a governing party, they're really going head to head with Labour in most of these places. And they're competing for voters who I think probably are more traditionally Labour inclined than Conservative. And, I tend not to think about these things in strictly party political terms anyway. But, the obvious thing for them to do is to say, yes, we'll spend more. Yes, we'll protect your benefits. We'll also cut taxes, and we'll do a lot of other things that you like as well. I think the challenge for them, though, is as they get closer and closer to government, there will be a lot more scrutiny of whether the plans add up. Now, if you are a protest party, you can kind of pick and mix. And your overall platform doesn't have to be terribly coherent. In fact, you can present different facets of your party and your agenda to different people in different places. If you're really talking about forming a national government, it has to add up, and it has to fit together, and it has to be coherent. And I think that's something that reform probably should be very wary about. Making too many of these big commitments now, which become hostages to fortune down the line, and potentially undermine their credibility. But look, I'm not really the person to come to for political advice. I've never stood for election, and I never want to. I'm not a member of any political party or even a supporter of one. But I think the thing is, from my perspective, we need to have rationality and honesty in public debate. And of course, I'm looking at this from a perspective where it's not just that we have high taxes and high spending now. We also have an aging population, which is going to add hugely to the spending pressures of the state over the coming decades. I think it's something like an extra 10 or 11% of GDP the OBR predicts we will have to spend on the elderly by 2070 or something. Now, that's huge. That's like doubling everybody's income tax bill just to keep up with spending pressures, not with changing policies, not with making the welfare state more generous. Now, if you're looking at that coming down the track, and then you're attacking the government for every tiny tweak to save a few hundred million or a few billion here and there, this doesn't seem to me to be a very responsible approach, or one that's likely to succeed politically or otherwise in the long run.
Well, by 2070, I'll either be 103 or dead, so possibly won't be doubling my own income tax. Tom, just final question. June the 11th is not a fiscal event, so there shouldn't be, or there may be, but there shouldn't be announcements on taxes. Looking ahead to the next budget in the autumn, where we are now, what do you think the chances are of more tax rises that Rachel Reeves will have to put in place to be able to stick to her fiscal rules?
I would be completely shocked if we didn't have another extension of the freeze on various tax thresholds. I don't think those tax thresholds are going to move over this parliament. I think they'll keep pushing the extent of those tax threshold freezes out further and further into the future to try and meet the fiscal rules. So that is in practice a tax increase when thresholds don't rise with inflation. It doesn't tend to be seen as one. I think that's our starting point. Can't imagine that won't happen. Everything else, look, people say she's got a 5 billion black hole. People say it could be up to 30 billion. First of all, I think trying to fine-tune fiscal policy in real time like this is crazy. We need to rethink the fiscal rules and the way they work if this is the outcome. Obviously, chancellors need to allow themselves a bit more headroom so they don't get into this situation, because it is so toxic, it's so damaging for confidence to constantly be speculating about what tax increases are going to happen in a few months. It's great for me as a think tanker, especially one who's focused on tax for a big part of my career, keeps me in business. But I think for the wider economy, this is no good at all. The problem is there are huge pressures. It's going to be difficult for them to cut spending. They're going to want to raise taxes, but they already said, oh, sorry, business, we know you hated the last autumn statement or the last budget, but we're not going to go there again. They've said no income tax, no VAT, no national insurance, and they've already done the kind of sneaky thing by saying employers' national insurance doesn't count. Not sure they can pull that one again. So where exactly do they get these extra billions that they're going to need? I think the problem is in this scenario, either they tear up some of their pledges, and that could be politically extremely damaging, or they have to basically they're forced into pursuing really terrible and destructive tax policies. So I think the obvious things, sadly, are around savings, around investments, around pensions, about a lot of the things that help us to accumulate capital and be prosperous in the future as a country. I think that there will be probably heavier taxes coming on those. And then I also think they're bound to kind of take another look at industries that are just kind of unpopular and they think they can get away with. So bank surcharge, tobacco taxes, oil and gas levies, etc. Now, these things, unfortunately, are quite destructive. But they are more politically saleable. And I think that might be the situation we're in. And again, this kind of goes back to my bigger point, that we're not really thinking things through in an economic way. We're not really thinking things through in a long-term way. We're making policy on the fly to try and meet some fairly arbitrary deadlines or targets, I should say. And as a result, we're just getting into an unhappier and unhappier situation.
Tom Clockerty, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea.
My pleasure.
To pick up on what Tom was saying there about reform and the political dynamics of this, you and I, Kamal, were at that big speech Farage gave in Westminster where he redefined reform as an economically left-wing party, let's be honest. And he said two things that stood out for me. One was when pressed about the costs of the welfare spending he endorses, he said it's a small amount. It doesn't matter compared to the overall size of the deficit. The second thing was he emphasized that he saw no contradiction between being pro-worker and pro-entrepreneur. But there are elements of the government's programme and of welfare spending and of spending in general which are not good for entrepreneurs or the middle class in the sense that you have to raid us to pay for it. An example of that is public sector workers. There are, 9 million people in this country who work for the public sector? If you're pro-worker, surely you're pro-giving them an increase. But if you do that, the middle class has to pay for it. So there is a tension. There is a fight there that he is arguably dodging by not saying we're going to be fiscally disciplined and make tough choices about where we do and don't spend money.
And I think, to Tom's point, it's those inconsistencies that will be played out over the next 2 to 3 years as the public start focusing on the fact that this man could be the next Prime Minister and could lead the next government. I think in terms of his tone yesterday, what was also interesting, adding to what you've said, is that his answers were robust on can you really find these savings you say you're going to save from closing down a load of quangos or ending DEI initiatives? And he was quite blasé, although strong, he was quite blasé in his answers, saying, oh yes, we might be being a bit over-optimistic on those things, but we can find the savings elsewhere if necessary. And I think he's touched on something that, Tim, you and I spoke about before we came on the podcast, that the public at present simply aren't putting what I would describe as fiscal discipline as being important from politicians. Yeah. They are more concerned with what might traditionally be spoken about as social and cultural issues. So controlling the borders, immigration, fixing the NHS, supporting the police, more money for education. They want more of everything. And they are not bothered by this idea of bankrupting the country that future generations will have to pay for. And I think COVID has had a huge effect on what we imagine the state should be there for. And I go back to reading Anthony Seldon's biography of Liz Truss, and Tom mentioned, the Liz Truss's very short premiership. Even Liz Truss, who is someone with strong Thatcherite credentials, felt that the government should pay people's gas bills. And that, for me, my generation, Tim,
yes,
that is an astonishing position. I was brought up, through the Thatcher era and then into Blair. And the state creep that we have had from COVID and then since COVID is really remarkable.
Yeah, all I would say in defense of the people,
I love the people.
And I wrote this in my sketch. It's true that Nigel's numbers don't add up and Rachel's numbers don't add up, but my numbers don't add up. And when people's incomes are squeezed by the rising cost of living, when the taxes have gone up, when the services are getting worse, when their pay is not increased enough to keep up with all of this, it's understandable that they expect the government to do something. And they're not going to support cuts to their own income when their own income is being squeezed. This is the trap we got into in the late 70s. Why were all these unions constantly on strike demanding more pay increases? It was greed. But it was also because, to be fair, the cost of living had gone up so dramatically that they were just trying to keep pace with it. And that's some of what's going on here.